"Go sit in the break room, nurse. You're not needed out here tonight." That was the sentence the new airport medical director said in the middle of the worst storm of the winter, in front of the whole clinic, on a Friday night that nobody in that terminal would ever forget, and he said it the way a man waves off a waiter, without bothering to look up from the tablet in his hands. As if the woman he was benching were a thing and not a person, as if she were a piece of old furniture that had cluttered up his clinic long enough. And the woman he was benching, the quiet older nurse he had decided within his first month was too old and too slow and too far beneath him to run a shift on a serious night, did not argue and did not flinch, and did not say the one sentence that would have stopped him cold if she had chosen to say it. Because she had learned a very long time ago that the people who need to tell you that you do not belong are almost never the people who will listen if you try to tell them why you do. So she set down the supply log in her hands, and she gave him a small, even nod, and she walked off the clinic floor toward the break room with her spine straight and her face calm, and not one of the people watching her go had any idea that the woman the director had just sent away had once run the casualty floor of a deployed surgical unit on the nights when broken aircraft and burning wreckage and the worst hurt human beings a bad night in a far worse place could. Produce came through the doors faster than there were hands to hold them. Her name was Dana Vance, and before that night was through, this airport was going to find out what that name had once meant. She was 48 years old. She had been a nurse for 22 of those years, the last 4 of them staffing the small on-site emergency medical clinic at a big regional airport, a busy modern hub that moved tens of thousands of travelers a day through its concourses and sat alone at the edge of a wide valley with the nearest real trauma center the better part of an hour away down a long highway. She worked the quiet, thankless medicine that an airport clinic is built for, the fainting passengers and the chest pains at the gate and the travelers who slipped on a wet floor, and she worked the shifts nobody else wanted and the overnights nobody else would take, because the work was honest and the clinic ran better when she was on it, and everyone knew it, even the ones who would never have said so out loud. She moved through the terminal the way still water moves through a channel cut long ago, slow and certain and easy to underestimate. And she had a way of being in a room that made the room calmer without anyone quite being able to say why. And on the night everything began to come apart, she was exactly where she always was, at the counter of the little clinic just off the main concourse, clipping a worn matte gray aluminum signal whistle on a faded olive paracord lanyard onto the reel of her ID badge before she went out to do her job. The whistle was old. The aluminum had gone dull and soft-cornered from years of being gripped and dropped and gripped again, and there was a fine dent in one side, and clipped beside it on the same faded cord was a small dull coin, plain metal gone gray. The kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though no one in that clinic had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was or where it had come from. She checked the whistle the way some people check a watch before a long day, a small habit of pressing her thumb against the cool gray metal and feeling the weight of it, and then she squared the badge reel against her chest and rolled her shoulders once and stepped out into the bright, wide hum of a working terminal. She was a creature of small rituals, the kind of rituals you only build if at some point in your life the whole world came apart at once, and the small thing on your chest was how you pulled a crowd of the dying back from the edge. But nobody here knew that, and so to them the whistle was just an old woman's clutter. One more reason the new director had decided she was a relic. The new director's name was Dr. Adrian Cole, and he was 39 years old, and he was, by every measure a hiring committee knows how to measure, impressive. He had trained at good programs and run a sleek urgent care group in the city and come to the airport clinic as its new contract medical director, brought in to modernize a sleepy little station into a tight metric-driven operation. And he had arrived with the absolute, unshakable, frictionless confidence of a man who had been the most polished person in every room he had ever entered and had never once been made to wonder whether the polish was the whole of the thing. He was not exactly a cruel man. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous than cruel, which is a capable man who has come to believe that capability is the only currency that exists, that the letters after a name and the title on a door are the same thing as the size of the person, and that an airport clinic nurse pushing 50 was, by simple arithmetic, a nurse who had never been good enough to be anything more than that. He looked at Dana Vance, with her gray hair and her unhurried hands and her battered whistle on a fraying cord, and he saw the past. He saw the way things used to be done before people like him came to fix them. He felt, in the weightless, careless way a person feels it about someone they have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as a concern for standards. It had started small, the way these things do. In his first week, he had watched her quietly reorganize a supply cart so the things you grab in an emergency were where a person's hand goes for them under stress. And instead of recognizing the hard-won logic of it, he had been faintly irritated, as if she were getting above herself by knowing something he had not told her. He had corrected her on a point of his own preference as if she were a student, and she had said yes, doctor, and changed nothing about how well she worked. And that, too, had irritated him. He had noticed the whistle and the coin on her badge and made a remark about clutter and professionalism, and she had said she understood and gone on carrying them. He had found out that she ran her own quiet drills on the slow overnight hours, walking the terminal, checking where the spare oxygen and the backboards and the burn kits were stored, timing how long it took to reach the far gates. Asking once in a staff meeting whether anyone had a real plan for a mass casualty event at the airport beyond calling the city and waiting, and he had laughed, a small indulgent laugh, and told her that this was a modern facility with a memorandum of understanding and a regional response plan, not a war zone, and that she should focus on her assigned duties. And every small, frictionless dismissal that she absorbed without complaint, he read as proof that she had no answer, when in truth it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply decided across 22 years that they were not for him. So it had grown. By his second month, she was the nurse he scheduled off the serious shifts. By his third, he had stopped saying her name. And on the Friday night the storm rolled in, he benched her off the clinic floor in front of everyone, over nothing, to make a point about whose clinic it was. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet, useless anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the whole place up when it starts to come down in the cold and the dark. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring, and that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened in that terminal before the night was through is the kind of thing that, if you had been standing at the back of that clinic watching a sleek young director send a quiet old nurse off the floor, you would never have looked at one the same way again. The storm had been building all afternoon, the kind of weather the valley got only once or twice a winter, a freezing rain that came in on a low gray ceiling and laid a skin of clear ice over everything it touched: the roads and the runways and the wings of the aircraft. An ice that was worse than snow because you could not see it and could not plow it and could not do much of anything about it, but wait for it to stop. By evening, the airport was halfway to a standstill, departing flights canceled one after another and the boards going red, the Diddick crews fighting a losing fight out on the ramp, the terminal filling with stranded travelers who could not leave because the planes could not go and could not drive home because the roads were already glazing over and closing. A great anxious crowd of stuck people thickening in the concourses with nowhere to be. Dana had read the sky that afternoon the way she read everything, through the tall windows at the end of the concourse, and she had not liked what she saw, and she had felt very faintly the old prickle at the back of her neck, the specific awareness of a night that was getting ready to test something. She had said as much, mildly, to Dr. Cole, that a night like this, with the ramp icing and inbound flights still trying to get down, might be a night to have extra hands and extra gear staged, and he had told her that the airport had a plan and that she was not the airport, and an hour later, when she checked a backboard cabinet on her own initiative and was a few minutes late returning to the desk. He had used it as the reason to bench her in front of everyone and send her to the break room to sit out the storm. So she went. She did not slam anything, and she did not cry, and she did not look around at the younger staff for the sympathy that a person reaches for when they have been humiliated and need a witness. She went, instead, very still and very calm, calmer than the moment called for, a stillness that did not look like the stillness of a woman who has been broken, but like the stillness of a woman who has been somewhere far worse than this and has trained her body over and over not to spend its strength on anything that does not matter. For 1 second, her eyes went flat and level and entirely without fear, and they rested on Dr. Cole the way you might look at weather, at something large and impersonal that you cannot argue with and must simply outlast. And then she gave the smallest nod and she walked off the floor. One of the younger clinic techs, an observant young man named Marcus, who had worked beside Dana for a year, watched her go with a frown because Marcus had noticed. The way you notice a thing without being able to name it, that the nurse who had just been benched had taken it like someone for whom being sent out of a room was nowhere near the worst thing that had ever happened to her in one. She did not go to the break room. She stood for a moment in the back corridor behind the clinic after the door swung shut behind her, and she did the thing she always did, which was to reach up, without quite deciding to, and let her thumb find the small worn coin clipped beside the whistle on her badge and turn it over once, the way she always did when something was about to go wrong or already had. That coin was older than Dr. Adrian Cole's entire career. It had been pressed into her palm in the gray light of a forward casualty receiving station at the end of the worst stretch of her life by a man with the smell of jet fuel and burned wiring still in his clothes and other people's blood dried brown to his sleeves, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had done do not get parades, they get to go home. And the coin is so that on the days the world tells you that you are nothing, you remember the nights you were everything. The whistle had come from the same man and the same place, and she did not say any of that, not to Marcus when he slipped back a few minutes later to quietly ask if she was all right, not to anyone. She said she was fine and that she would wait it out, and she did the one thing she could not stop herself from doing, which was to stand at the corridor window where she could see the runways through the freezing rain and watch the lights of the aircraft still trying to come down, because some part of her had never in her life been able to look away from a sky that was about to drop something. There was a second figure in the small theater of Dana's working life that winter, and he was not a clinician. and never went near a patient, which somehow made him worse, because a person who can diminish you from behind a desk with a policy and a metric is a person with a very long reach. His name was Gerald Pruitt, and he was 53, and his title had to do with operations and compliance and risk. The kind of administrator who had risen through the management of an airport without ever once standing in a room where someone was dying, and who moved through his work like a man reading a balance sheet that happened to be made of people and throughput and liability exposure. He had heard about the clinic nurse who ran her own drills on the quiet hours of a shift, who walked the concourses when they were empty and checked where the emergency gear was kept and how long the far gates took to reach, who had asked once in a meeting whether anyone had a real plan for the airport if a full aircraft ever came down on or near the field with the roads closed, beyond the assumption that the regional system would handle it, and who had been told, with the same small, indulgent laugh she got from everyone, that this was an accredited modern facility with a response plan on file, and that she should mind her assigned duties. Gerald Pruitt did not find her reassuring. He found her a liability, because a nurse doing unscripted things and asking unscripted questions was a variable he could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of his religion. So he had begun, quietly, to build a file. He had her after-hours drills noted as unauthorized presence in operational areas. He had the small extra kit she kept staged in a locker near the clinic, a roll of supplies and tourniquets, and a few field expedient tools noted as unapproved equipment outside the standard inventory. He had the whistle, in an email, as a personal item, creating a professionalism and foreign object concern in the clinical environment, a phrase he was rather proud of. And when Dr. Cole, newly arrived and eager to put his stamp on things, had stopped by the operations office to remark, half joking, that the clinic was being held back by an old nurse who carried a whistle and a coin around like good luck charms and drilled for disasters that a modern airport had a plan for, Gerald Pruitt had listened with a growing sense of vindication, because here was an impressive new director confirming everything his file already said. The write-up itself had come the very week before the storm, a printed sheet that a nervous junior coordinator had handed Dana in person because Gerald Pruitt believed in a paper trail. It was a formal counseling notice, and it cited the drills and the staged kit and, in a separate line, the personal items on her badge. And at the bottom, there was a place for her to sign, acknowledging that she understood. She had set the paper down on the clinic counter. She had reached up without quite deciding to, and her thumb had found the small worn coin clipped beside the whistle, and she had turned it over once, the way she always did when something was about to make a mistake, and the narration of her own life had gone very quiet in her chest. She had looked at the coordinator's apologetic face and picked up the pen and signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not spend your strength arguing with a system that is certain it has you figured out, and you save it for the night the system needs to find out whether it did. What none of them knew, what was written in no file at this airport or in Gerald Pruitt's office or anywhere a hiring committee would ever think to look, was where Dana Vance had spent the 10 years before she had ever clipped on a badge at a quiet airport clinic. She had worn a different uniform and answered to a rank instead of a name tag, and she had been the chief nurse of a deployed expeditionary medical unit, a fast, hard surgical and casualty receiving element that set up wherever the wounded were and could not wait, and the worst nights of that job, the nights that built her, were the ones when aircraft came down. She had run the casualty floor when a transport went in hard on a bad strip and the wounded came off it burned and broken and crushed, and when a bird was hit and limped back to a field and spilled its load of the dying onto her tables, and when a whole staging area full of people had to be sorted and saved at once with the power flickering and the cold coming through the walls and more arriving, then there were hands. She had not just bandaged, she had run the floor. She had led the team that opened and packed and stopped the bleeding that would have killed a person in minutes, done the fast, brutal damage control medicine whose only goal is to stop the dying now and move them on alive, and she had learned on those nights the specific, terrible art of an aircraft mass casualty, the burns and the blast and the crush and the smoke all arriving together in a crowd, the sorting of the many when you cannot save everyone at once. And she had learned out there the thing that no civilian clinic can teach and no plan on a shelf can hold, which is how to do this work when the building and the weather and the chaos are all trying to kill your patients too, in the cold and the noise and the dark, with help an hour away on roads that were cut, with more dying than there were hands, and a way of standing in the center of all of it and feeling the panic rise in her own throat, and setting it down, deliberately like a tool she could not use right now, and starting to sort. She had learned that in a true mass casualty load, the most dangerous instinct any clinician has is the urge to pour everything into the first person they see, because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes, and the whole grim art of it is to move past the loud to reach the silent. She had learned to control a hemorrhage by feel, to read a crushed chest and a closing airway with her hands, to command a crowd of frightened survivors with her voice and a whistle and turn them from a mob into 100 pairs of working hands. She had buried friends who never learned to move past the loud, and friends a bad night simply erased, and she had carried home, folded up small, the certainty that the worst thing about a disaster is not the disaster, but the way it finds out, instantly and without mercy, exactly who in the place actually knows what to do. And there was a particular kind of night that had taught her more than all the rest, and it was the aircraft night, the night a bird went down, because an aircraft mass casualty is its own terrible specialty, different from any other disaster, and she had become, out there, one of the few people on Earth who truly knew it. She had learned that when a plane comes down, it does not produce one kind of casualty, it produces all of them at once. In a crowd, the burns from the fuel and the friction heat of metal on ground, the blast lung and the ruptured ears of people who were inside a fuselage when it broke, the crush of seats and structure folding around bodies, the broken backs and necks of an impact that throws a human being against a frame, the smoke in the lungs of everyone who breathed near the fire, the hypothermia that takes hold of every shocked body when an aircraft goes down somewhere cold, and the simple drowning panic of 100 terrified survivors with nowhere to run, all of it arriving together, all of it at once. She had learned that the survivors who walk away from a crash on their own legs are not safe, that some of them are carrying the silent injuries that kill an hour later, the bleeding inside, the air leaking into a chest, the slow gray slide of a body that has lost more than it knows, and that the whole art of it is to look at a crowd of the upright and the walking and find, among them, the ones who are quietly dying before they fall. She had learned to manage burns with nothing, to keep the burned warm where they were not burned and cool where they were, and never to let a person freeze to death while you were treating their burns, a balance that has killed people who did not understand it. She had learned that in an aircraft event, you will always have more patients than you can treat in the first hour, and that the first hour is the one that decides everything, and that the only thing that gets a place through that first hour alive is a person who can hold the whole impossible shape of it in their head and not panic. She had run that first hour more times than she could count, and she had come in the end to a strange, grim peace with it, because she had learned that she was good at it, that whatever else was true of her, when a plane came down and the world ended for 100 people at once, she was the one who could stand in the middle of it and pull most of them back. And a person does not forget a thing like that about themselves, however quietly they choose to live afterward. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come home for good and traded the rank for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest nursing job she could find, and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than hand out ice packs and take blood pressures at a gate. She did not hide it out of shame. She hid it because she had learned that people treat you differently when they know, that they either lean on you too hard or resent you too much. And because the work itself, the actual work of taking good care of frightened sick people, was the same whether they knew or not, and she had wanted, more than she had wanted recognition, to simply be a nurse, to do the work and go home and not carry the war into every room she entered. So she let them write her up. She let the new director bench her. She let the administrator build his file. She kept the whistle and the coin, and she ran her drills alone on the slow nights, not because she expected anyone to thank her, but because some part of her had never fully believed the comfortable lie that it could not happen here, and she had decided a long time ago that she would rather be the only one ready than be caught the way she had once been caught, in the cold and the noise, with the wounded coming and nothing in her hands. There was one person at that airport who suspected there was more to her, and his name was Ray Donnelly, the night operations supervisor, a steady gray-haired man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years on airport ramps and in towers and control rooms and had an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on his evaluation. Ray had crossed paths with Dana for 4 years, and in 4 years he had noticed 100 small things the new director never saw. He had watched her eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide. He had watched her voice drop lower and slower when something went bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs. He had watched her glance once automatically at the exits and the fire stations and the wide doors a stretcher could fit through every single time she walked a new part of the terminal, the way some people check their mirrors. He had seen her, late one slow night, standing alone at the end of an empty concourse, with her lips moving, pacing off distances, laying out where she would put casualties and gear and a triage line if the place ever filled with the hurt all at once, and he had never asked her why. Because you did not ask Dana things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers an ordinary Ursum would explain. Once a cocky young clinic hire had rolled his eyes at Dana's whistle and her coin and muttered something about the burned-out old lifer who thought the airport was a battlefield, and Ray Donnelly had taken him aside very calmly and told him to leave her be, that the day was coming when he would want to be standing exactly where Dana Vance was standing, and he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The young man had laughed it off. Ray Donnelly had not been joking. The first sign that the night was going to be different came a little after 9 o'clock, while the freezing rain was still coming down and the terminal was packed with the stranded, and it came over Ray Donnelly's radio in the flat-clipped voice of a man trying very hard to stay calm. An inbound passenger jet, a full one, the last arrival they were going to allow before they closed the field entirely, was on final approach in the worst of the ice, and it was high and fast and fighting a crosswind, and the crew had already declared that conditions were marginal. And everyone who understood what they were hearing went quiet and turned toward the windows, because there is a particular silence that falls over people who work around aircraft when a landing is about to be bad. Dana, standing at the corridor window where she had been benched to wait, heard the change in the air before she heard any words, felt the whole terminal hold its breath, and she put her hand flat against the cold glass and watched the landing lights of the jet come down out of the gray, too steep, drifting, the way a thing comes down when the air and the ground have both turned against it. And the old machinery in her came awake without her permission, and she thought, with a calm that was its own kind of dread, here it comes. The jet touched down hard and long, well past where it should have, and the instant the wheels found the runway, the ice took it. There was no grip. The big aircraft, sliding now instead of rolling, its brakes and its reversers fighting an ice that gave them nothing, ran out the length of the runway in a long sick skid, drifting sideways as it went off the far end into the snow and the dark beyond the lights, and the soft ground that the cold had only half frozen took the nose gear and folded it, and the jet slewed and broke, the fuselage cracking open behind the wing, and slid to a stop at last in a spray of snow and torn metal a long way out from the terminal, in the freezing dark, with 100 and some people inside it and the worst night of the winter coming down all around. For one heartbeat, the whole airport was silent. And then the alarms began, and the radios came alive, and the night turned into something else entirely. Dana Vance was moving before the first alarm finished its first cycle. She did not run, because she had learned that running at the start of a disaster is how you fall and how you waste the thing you most need, which is the next 2 minutes of clear thought, but she came off that window and back toward the clinic at a fast, certain walk, and her mind was already 3 moves ahead, already laying out the shape of the night, because she had stood at the start of exactly this more times than she could count, and she knew, with a knowledge that lived in her bones and not her head, what was about to come through the doors, and how little time there was to get ready for it. The roads were ice. The city trauma centers were an hour away on a good night, and tonight there was no good road between here and there. The field was a sheet of glass that the ambulances and the fire trucks were going to crawl across. For the first and most critical part of this, for the part that decided who lived, the only care these people were going to get was whatever was already inside this terminal. And the only person inside this terminal who had ever done this before was a benched old nurse with a whistle on her badge. Dr. Adrian Cole, for his part, met the news the way he met everything, as a thing he was sure he could manage. He had heard a plane was down, and he had felt under the alarm a flicker of something almost like opportunity, the chance to be the calm authority in a crisis in front of a frightened crowd, and he had begun, briskly, to do the things that felt like command, calling the regional system and confirming that help was coming and telling his clinic staff to get ready to receive casualties, and for a few minutes, while there was nothing to do yet but wait and prepare, he looked exactly like the man the airport had hired. The trouble with being that man is that it teaches you that help is always coming, and that the system always holds, and Dr. Cole had never once in his life been in a place where the system did not hold and the help did not come, and so he had no idea, none, that he was about to be. The first casualties reached the terminal faster than anyone expected, because the able-bodied survivors who had walked away from the broken jet did not wait for the slow trucks crawling across the ice. They came toward the lights of the terminal on foot through the freezing rain, the walking wounded and the ones helping the worse hurt. A ragged stream of shocked, bleeding people stumbling in out of the dark across the ramp and through the doors, and behind them the airport fire crews began bringing in the ones who could not walk on whatever they could carry them on, and in the space of about 10 minutes, the bright, clean, modern terminal of a regional airport with its little first aid clinic built for fainting travelers filled up with the casualties of an aircraft crash. There were burns from the fuel and the friction. There were the crushed and broken from the impact and the folding cabin. There were people gray and quiet with the blast and crush injuries that come from a fuselage breaking around you. There was the cold taking hold of every one of them, shock and freezing rain together pulling the heat out of bodies that had none to spare. It was, in every particular, exactly the kind of casualty load Dana Vance had spent 10 years learning to command, arriving into exactly the kind of unprepared place that the comfortable assumption that it could not happen here always leaves behind. And Dr. Adrian Cole, standing in the doorway of his little clinic as the first of them came through, looking at a scope of catastrophe that no urgent care group and no metric and no memorandum of understanding had ever prepared him to face, felt his confidence drain out of him in the space of a single breath. There were too many. That was the first thing. The thing the plan on the shelf had never made real to him. That they did not come one at a time the way patients had always come to him his whole career, tidy and sequential and waiting their turn. They came all at once, a flood, a crowd of the dying filling a concourse, and there was no triage nurse calling them back, no order, no system, no way even to know who was hurt worst, just a rising tide of broken people and a handful of clinic staff, and the awful dawning understanding that the help he had called was an hour away on roads that were closed. He tried to do what he knew. He grabbed the nearest badly burned man and began, with real skill, to work on him, because working on the patient in front of him was the only thing his training had ever taught him to do, and he poured himself into that one man while behind him and around him 100 others bled and froze and slipped away unattended, and he had no idea, none, that by giving everything to the loudest, most visible casualty in front of him, he was doing the exact thing that, in a true mass casualty, kills the most people. He was a good clinician drowning, and he did not even know yet that he was in the water. If you've made it this far into Dana's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Up to now, you've watched a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something. But it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next hour, in a freezing terminal with a crashed jet's worth of the dying filling the concourse and the roads sealed in ice, and a polished young director discovering that everything he is, the training and the title and the urgent care confidence, has just been swept out from under him by a flood he was never taught to stand in. There is no way you walk away from this story once you've seen what the nurse he benched does when the plane comes off the runway and the terminal fills with the wounded and the only person left who knows how to run an aircraft mass casualty in the cold is the one he sent away. Dana came onto that concourse out of the back corridor, and she stopped for exactly 1 second at the edge of it and read the whole catastrophe in a single sweep, the way she had read 100 catastrophes before, and the picture resolved itself in her mind not as horror, but as a problem with a shape and a solution, because that was the gift the worst years of her life had given her, and the curse of it too. She saw the director on his knees pouring himself into one burned man, while the floor around him filled with the unattended. She saw the walking wounded milling and bleeding and beginning to panic, the way a crowd panics when no one is in charge. She saw the worse hurt being set down wherever there was space, in a spreading, disordered sprawl, the loud and the silent all mixed together, the dying getting no more attention than the merely frightened. She saw, in short, the single most dangerous thing in all of disaster medicine, which is a mass casualty event with no one doing triage, because a mass casualty with no one sorting is not a medical emergency. It is a massacre in slow motion. The wrong people helped first, and the right people dying while they wait. And Dana Vance felt the whole terrible weight of the night settle onto her shoulders, and she did not flinch, because she had carried exactly this weight before, and she knew that the only thing worse than carrying it was setting it down. She crossed to the director first, fast, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she said, low and even, just for him, Adrian, Adrian, look at me. You cannot do this one patient at a time. There are 100 of them, and you are giving everything to one. You have to stop right now and let me set up the floor, or most of these people are going to die in front of you while you save one. I have done this before. Let me run the triage and you do the medicine I send you. Please, and Dr. Cole looked up at her, his hands slick with another man's blood, his face gone pale and lost in a way she had seen on 100 good people in their first bad hour, and some part of him, the part that was a real clinician underneath the polish, understood in that instant that she was right and that he was drowning and that the woman he had benched 4 hours ago was throwing him a rope. He did not say anything. He gave her one small wrecked nod, and Dana Vance straightened up and turned to face the chaos of the terminal and became, in the space of a single breath, the person she had spent 4 years pretending not to be. She reached up to her badge and she unclipped the worn matte gray aluminum signal whistle. The clutter, the personal item that Gerald Pruitt had written up as a professionalism concern, and she filled her lungs and she blew it. One long, piercing blast that cut through the noise of that terminal like a blade through water. And every face on the concourse turned toward the sound. And then she climbed up onto a row of seats so they could see her, a gray-haired nurse with a whistle, and she raised her voice for the first time that night, not in panic but in command, the flat, enormous carrying voice she had used to control scenes in places these people could not imagine. And it filled the terminal and stopped the milling and held every frightened face on her. Listen to me, everybody who can hear me, listen. My name is Dana Vance, and I am running this floor until the trucks get here. We have a lot of hurt people, and not a lot of hands, and the roads are closed, and that means we do this in order, and I know the order. If you can walk, I need you on your feet and moving to the windows on my left, all of you, right now, because if you can walk, you can wait, and you can help, and in 1 minute, I am going to give some of you jobs. If you are with someone who cannot walk, stay with them and keep them still and keep them warm and do not move them until I or someone I send gets to you. Nobody carries anybody anywhere without me saying so. We are going to get to every single person on this floor. You are not alone in the cold. There is a system now, and I am the system, and it works. And the terminal, which had been on the edge of becoming a panicking mob, became, in the space of 30 seconds, something that could be saved, because one person who was not afraid had told it that it could be, what none of them could have known. What made the calm in her voice not a performance but a memory was that Dana Vance had stood in exactly this catastrophe before, not this terminal, not this airport, but this exact catastrophe, the shape of an aircraft coming down and spilling a crowd of the burned and the broken and the crushed into a cold, unready place all at once. She had stood in that more times than she could count. In a tent and a hangar and a hardened shelter, with the wind screaming outside, with the power flickering and help a long way off, and her own 2 hands and whatever discipline she had brought, and she had learned there the one lesson that this whole modern airport, with its plan on the shelf and its memorandum of understanding, had forgotten. which is that the plan is not the response. The plan is only the wish for a response, and that a person who knows the actual work, the human hands and judgment work of sorting and saving a crowd of the dying, can do it when the plan falls apart, and a person who has only ever had the plan cannot. That was the thing the crash revealed in the space of 2 minutes about everyone in that terminal. It did not make Dana Vance good. She had always been good. It simply, finally swept away everything that had been hiding it. Marcus, she said, not raising her voice now, because she had learned that you do not need to raise your voice if your voice is certain, only if it is afraid. And she named the young clinic tech the way you throw a rope to a person in water. I need you. There are backboards and the big trauma kits in the storage room behind the clinic, and a staged kit in the locker by the door, the gray one. I checked it last week. Go now, fast, but do not run. Bring all of it and every pair of gloves you can carry, and on your way send anyone in a uniform you find to me. Ray. She found the night operations supervisor in the crowd with her eyes because she had clocked him the instant she came onto the floor, the one other person here with the bearing of someone who had run things. Ray, I need the heat turned up in this concourse as high as it will go, and I need every blanket in this building, the emergency ones, the cabin ones, anything. Cold is killing these people as fast as the injuries. And I need the gate areas cleared so I have floor space and a clear lane down the middle for stretchers. Can you do that? And Ray Donnelly, who had been waiting 4 years to find out if the thing he had always suspected about Dana Vance was true, and who now knew, said only, "On it, Captain," and was gone, and did not even notice the word that had come out of him until later. And neither did anyone else. Yet, and then Dana Vance did the thing that only she on that floor knew how to do, the thing that is the actual heart of disaster medicine, and that no amount of skill at a single patient can teach, which is triage, real triage, the fast, merciless sorting of the many when you cannot save everyone at once. She went down the concourse with Dr. Cole at her shoulder now, the director following the nurse, learning at her side the thing his 15 years had never taught him, and at each person she stopped for no more than a few seconds. Because triage is not treatment, triage is deciding, and she read each one the way she had been trained to read them in the worst classroom in the world, the ones who were walking and talking and angry, who would keep, the ones who were quiet and gray and slipping, who would die in minutes without help and could be saved with it, who went to the front of the line, and the few, the terrible few, who were beyond what a freezing terminal could do for them tonight, for whom the kindest and hardest decision was to make them warm and comfortable and spend the scarce hands on the ones who could still be pulled back. She moved past the loud to reach the silent, the way she had taught younger clinicians to do in a life no one here knew about, and she marked each person with a quick word and a torn strip of tape and a number, building order out of chaos one body at a time, and behind her the walking wounded she had pressed into service began to carry and to fetch and to hold pressure where she showed them. And the cold concourse became a machine, and the machine began, against all of it, to save lives. Dr. Cole, following her, watched it happen and felt his entire understanding of his profession come apart and rebuild itself in the space of an hour. He had believed his whole career that medicine was a thing of knowledge, of the right diagnosis and the right procedure done well. And he was good at it, and he had quietly believed that the knowledge was the whole of it, and that a nurse was the hands that carried out what the knowledge decided. And now he watched a nurse do something he had never been taught, something there was no protocol for. something that was not knowledge but judgment, the lightning sorting of a concourse full of the dying under pressure, with no information and no time, getting it right, again and again, calling which patient needed the next pair of hands, and which one could wait, and which one, gently, could not be saved, and being right, and Adrian Cole understood that he was watching a kind of medicine he had not known existed, practiced by a person the airport had decided was beneath the director, and he was never going to be able to unsee it. At one point, between patients, he said quietly, almost helplessly, "How do you know? How do you decide who?" And Dana, not breaking stride, moving to the next body in the cold, said only practice, and went on, and Adrian Cole looked at the back of the gray-haired nurse moving sure-footed through a catastrophe and thought, where do you practice this? And did not yet know that the answer was crawling across the ice toward the terminal at that very moment. The first real test of the new order came not 10 minutes later, and it came in the form of a young woman near the windows whom a less practiced eye would have walked right past. She was quiet. She was sitting up against a pillar, awake, not screaming, not bleeding that anyone could see, asking in a small, polite voice whether someone could check on the man she had been sitting next to on the plane, and every instinct that a frightened crowd has would have left her for last, because she was not loud. But Dana Vance stopped at her for the length of a single breath, and she did not like what she saw. The particular gray sheen of her skin, the way her breathing had a small hitch at the top of it, the way she was holding herself, just slightly hunched, and still in a way that a person holds themselves when moving hurts in a place they cannot name, and she put 2 fingers against the woman's neck and then laid a hand flat on each side of her chest, and then she went very still, because she had seen this exact quiet dying young woman 100 times in another life, and she knew what was killing her. There was air leaking into the space around one of her lungs, building up with every breath she took, a pressure rising in her chest that would, in a matter of minutes, squeeze her heart until it could not fill, and she would die, quietly, politely, asking after a stranger, while the loud and the bloody got all the hands. It is the kind of thing that kills people in disasters precisely because it is silent, and it is the kind of thing a scan and a monitor would have caught in a lit hospital in seconds. And there was no scan and no monitor. There was only a freezing terminal and a nurse who had learned to find it with her hands. "Adrian," she said, and her voice did not change, but Dr. Cole, who was learning that night to listen for the things that lived under her calm, came at once. "I need you, and I need you to watch this, because you are going to see this again in your life, and the next time I might not be standing next to you. This woman has a tension building in her chest. Feel here, feel the difference between the 2 sides. Listen to how the breath sounds wrong on this side. Her windpipe is starting to push away from it. She is going to arrest in a few minutes, and you will not know why, unless you already know why, and now you will know why." And Adrian, his hands on the young woman's chest, felt it, the thing the textbook had told him about, and he had never once felt for real, and his eyes went wide, and Dana was already moving, calm and fast, because she had decompressed more chests in the field than she could count, and her hands did not need a scan to do it. She talked him through it as she did it. The landmark, the angle, the depth, the discipline of it, and she put a needle into the young woman's chest in the steady light of the terminal, and there was a hiss, a long sighing rush of trapped air escaping, and the young woman who had been quietly dying took a sudden, enormous gasping breath. her first full breath in 20 minutes, and the gray went out of her face, and she looked up at Dana in dazed astonishment. And Dana squeezed her shoulder once and said, "Better, you're all right. We'll get to your friend too." And she stood up and moved on to the next patient, leaving Adrian Cole kneeling there with his hands shaking and his entire understanding of his profession rearranged, because he had just watched a clinic nurse find and fix by feel in a freezing terminal, the silent thing that would have killed his patient, and he had not even known to look for it. It happened again, in a different shape, 20 minutes after that, and this time it was not a patient who nearly died, but a near catastrophe of a different kind, the kind that comes from good people doing the wrong thing fast under pressure. The airport fire crews, brave and capable men and women out of their depth in a medical mass casualty, had begun carrying the worst hurt in from the wreck and laying them down wherever they could, and one of them, with the best of intentions, was about to move a man with a badly broken back the wrong way and finish what the crash had started. Lifting him under the arms to drag him to a warmer spot, and Dana saw it from across the concourse and crossed the distance faster than seemed possible, and stopped him with a single sharp word. "Stop. Do not move him like that. Put him down, exactly flat, right where he is. His back is broken, and if you drag him, you will cut his spinal cord and he will never walk again, and the cold floor is a problem I can solve, and a severed cord is not. Leave him flat, get aboard, and 4 of you move him as one piece on my count or not at all." And the firefighter, who in any other moment might have bristled at a clinic nurse giving him an order, looked up at the calm, certain face and understood that she knew something he did not, and he put the man down, and they boarded him and moved him as one piece on her count, and a man who had been 30 seconds from a wheelchair for life kept the use of his legs because a nurse had crossed a concourse in time. That too, Adrian Cole saw from across the floor, and added to the slow avalanche of everything he was learning about the woman he had benched. The third test was the worst, and it was the one that nearly broke the new order before it had fully formed, because it came not as a single patient, but as a wave, a second surge of casualties arriving all at once when the airport fire crews finally got the heavy rescue equipment out to the broken fuselage and began freeing the people who had been trapped in the folded section of the cabin. They came in a rush, 8 and 10 at a time on backboards and in the arms of exhausted firefighters, the worst hurt of the whole crash, the ones the impact had pinned, and for a moment, the treatment area Dana had built threatened to be swamped. The way a seawall is overtopped by a wave that comes in higher than the last, and she felt the floor tilt toward chaos again. The helpers freezing, the line backing up, the panic rising at the edges. And this was the moment that would have finished a lesser leader, the moment a crowd looks to the person in charge, and the person in charge does not know what to do, and Dana Vance did the thing she had been built to do, which was to get bigger as the disaster got bigger instead of smaller, to plant herself in the middle of the new wave and slow it down by sheer force of will. She did not try to treat the surge. She re-triaged it fast, walking the line of new arrivals and sorting them in seconds, sending the ones who could wait to the cold floor by the windows with a helper and a blanket, pulling the 2 or 3 who were truly dying into the warm center where Adrian and the firefighters could work them. And she did it without a wasted second, because she had learned the hardest truth of mass casualty medicine, which is that a second wave is not a catastrophe, but a test of the system you built for the first, and that if the system is good, it bends and holds, and if you panic, it breaks. Her system held. The wave came in and was absorbed and sorted and folded into the machine, and the people who watched it happen. Adrian and Ray and the firefighters and the survivors pressed into service, understood that they had just watched something they had no name for, a person doing under crushing pressure the one thing almost nobody can do, which is to think clearly and move calmly while the worst night of everyone else's life broke over all of them at once. There was a fourth moment, quieter than the others, and in some ways the one that told the most about her, and it came from a casualty no one expected to be a problem. A big, frightened man who was not badly hurt at all, but who had come unglued, the way some people do in a disaster, and was on his feet and shouting and trying to pull a helper away from a patient to make them tend to a friend of his, who was already being cared for, the panic in one man threatening to spread to the whole fragile crowd like a spark in dry grass. And the new director did not know what to do with him, because nothing in 15 years of medicine teaches you how to handle the human chaos at the edge of a medical disaster, and Dana crossed to the man and did not shout back and did not have him hauled away. She did something harder. She got very close and very calm and put a hand flat on his chest and looked up into his wild face and said, low and even, I know. I know. Your friend is being taken care of. I promise you, I have eyes on him. And I need you. Because you're strong and you're standing, and I am short of hands. I need you to carry blankets to those people by the window and put one on each of them and tell me if any of them stop talking to you. Can you do that for me? I need you to do that. And the man, given a job, given a purpose, given a calm to borrow instead of a panic to feed, came down out of his terror in the space of 3 breaths and went and carried the blankets and became, for the rest of the night, one of her most tireless helpers, and Adrienne Cole watched her turn a dangerous man into a useful one with nothing but her voice, and understood that he was watching a kind of command that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the thing underneath it, and added that too to the avalanche. The next hour was the longest and the finest work of Dana Vance's civilian life, and she ran it the way she had run worse, fast and exact, and without a wasted motion, holding a dozen things in her head at once and never dropping any of them. She kept the triage line moving and re-moving, reassessing, because triage is not a thing you do once, but a thing you do over and over as people change, pulling a patient up the priority list when they began to slip and easing one down when they stabilized. She built a treatment area out of nothing, a row of the worst cases laid out in the warmest part of the cleared concourse with the blankets Ray had found heaped over them against the cold, and she moved along it again and again, controlling hemorrhages with tourniquets from her staged kit, and with pressure, and with packing, splinting the broken with backboards and rolled blankets and whatever the terminal could give her, managing the burns the fuel had caused with the burn dressings she had made sure were stocked, and with clean, cool water, and with the discipline of keeping the burned warm everywhere they were not burned. She organized the able-bodied survivors into the machine that runs a mass casualty, some carrying, some fetching supplies from the clinic, some kneeling beside a single patient with one simple job, hold this here and tell me if it changes, turning 100 frightened bystanders into 100 pairs of working hands. And she taught while she worked, always teaching, showing Marcus how to seat a tourniquet so it actually stopped the bleeding instead of just hurting, showing Adrian how to read a belly with his hands when there was no scan, showing a terrified gate agent how to hold a light and a hand at the same time, building confidence into the people around her even as she used them. Because that, too, was something she had learned in the place no one knew about, that the leader's job in a disaster is not to do everything, but to make everyone around her better than they thought they could be. And Dr. Adrienne Cole changed hour by hour on that freezing floor. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen with a speech. It happened in 100 small moments, in the way he started, without being aware of it, to look to her between patients, to ask, "What's next? Where do you need me?" To defer, the polished man deferring, not because he had been beaten, but because he had been shown something truer than polish. At one point, deep in the worst of it, he found himself kneeling next to her over a slipping casualty, both of them working, and he said, in a low voice that had nothing left in it of the man who had benched her, "I don't understand how you know how to do this. Any of this. The triage, the sorting, the way you just, I trained for 15 years and I froze the second I saw the floor, and you didn't even slow down. Where does an airport clinic nurse learn to run an aircraft mass casualty in the cold?" And Dana Vance, who could have answered, who had every right after the night he had given her to answer, looked at him for a moment in the bright, hard terminal light. And then she said only, "Same place anybody learns anything that matters. Somewhere bad enough to make me learn it." And she went back to work and left him with the question still open, because she was not ready to give it to him, and because the night was not done with either of them yet. The question, though, had been asked aloud now, and once a question like that is in the air, it does not go away, it spreads. Marcus had wondered it, watching her seat a tourniquet in 3 seconds flat. Adrian had asked it outright. A paramedic who finally made it across the ice and through the doors took one look at the triage line and the treatment area and the order of the whole thing and said, to no one in particular, "Who set all this up?" and was told, "The nurse," and stared. Ray Donnelly, who had suspected the answer for 4 years and had already let the word captain slip without quite meaning to, watched the others arrive at the edge of it and said nothing, because it was not his to tell. And the casualties themselves, the ones who were awake, the frightened broken people on that cold floor, felt it without knowing the words for it, felt that the gray-haired woman moving among them with a whistle was not what she appeared to be, that there was something underneath the plain scrubs and the quiet voice, some authority that did not come from her badge, and they trusted her the way you trust a thing your body recognizes before your mind does. The whole terminal, in the cold, had begun to orbit her, and the only person who still did not fully understand what he was looking at was, for a while longer, the one man whose entire career had depended on never having to find out. It was somewhere past 11 o'clock when the real help finally began to arrive in force, because the storm had cut the roads, and an aircraft down at an airport with the highways closed is the kind of thing that pulls every emergency resource in the region toward it through the worst of a night slowly across the ice. The first to reach the terminal in any number was not the city ambulances, which were still crawling out the long frozen highway one at a time, but a regional disaster medical assistance team, a self-contained unit of doctors and nurses and logisticians who train for exactly this, who load their own gear and their own shelter and their own supplies and deploy to where a disaster has overwhelmed the local system. And they had fought their way to the airport through the storm on a convoy of high-clearance vehicles and came in through the terminal doors led by their team commander, a weathered man in his 50s with a steady manner and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime walking into the worst places and taking charge of them. His name was Thomas Hale, and he had been many things in his life before he led civilian disaster teams, and he came in onto that concourse expecting to find panic and a leadership vacuum and to have to build order out of nothing, the way he always did. What he found instead stopped him just inside the doors. He found a freezing terminal running like a clock. He found a triage line that was textbook, better than textbook, the casualties sorted and marked and ordered with a precision he had seen in very few places in his life, and almost never in a facility like this. He found a treatment area laid out the way he himself would have laid it out, the worst cases warm and worked, and the walking wounded organized into work parties, hemorrhages controlled and airways managed and the cold held back with heaped blankets, a whole aircraft mass casualty folded into a calm functioning machine, and at the center of it moving from patient to patient with a whistle on her badge and a quiet voice, an unhurried gray-haired nurse who was, very clearly and without any question, the person running all of it. And Thomas Hale, who had walked into 100 disasters and read the person in charge in a single glance, stood in that doorway and watched her work for a long moment, and a strange expression came over his weathered face, because the way she moved, the way she sorted, the specific drilled economy of her, the particular way she held herself and read a wound and gave an order, was a way he had seen before, long ago, in another life, in a place very far from here, and it was a way that almost nobody on earth moved, and he felt the hair stand up on the back of his neck as an impossible recognition began to surface in him out of a past he had thought he had left behind for good. He came across the floor toward her slowly, through the controlled chaos, watching her, and she was so deep in the work, kneeling over a slipping casualty and bringing him back, that she did not see him until he was close. And then she looked up, with the bright terminal light catching the lines of her gray-haired face, and Thomas Hale looked down into the face of the nurse running the disaster. And the last of the doubt left him, and the years fell away, and he said, into the noise of that cold floor, in a voice gone rough with disbelief, the name and the word that no one in this airport had ever heard, the name that belonged to the other life, the words that were about to change how every person on that floor understood the woman they had spent the night following. Captain Vance? He said. My God, Captain Dana Vance. Is that you? The word landed on that cold floor and rippled outward, and the people near enough to hear it turned, one by one, because there is no mistaking the sound of a name being spoken by someone who knew it in another life, the weight of it, the history in it. Captain Dana, who had been kneeling over her patient, went still for a moment, and then she finished what her hands were doing, because the patient came first and always had, and only then did she look up fully at the weathered face above her, and something moved across her own composed features, a recognition coming back the other way across all the years, and she said, quietly, Hale. Sergeant Hale. It's been a long time, and the big team commander let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and almost something else, and he said, It has, Captain. It surely has. And he straightened, and without seeming to decide to, in the middle of a freezing, crowded terminal, he came to attention, and he saluted her, the old crisp reflex of a man honoring someone he had once followed into the worst place either of them had ever been, and the gesture said, to everyone watching, more than any explanation could have. And then, because the floor had gone quiet around them, and the question that had been hanging in the cold all night was finally going to be answered, Thomas Hale turned to the staring faces of the clinic staff and the firefighters and the survivors, and he told them, in a few plain sentences, who the woman they had been following actually was. He told them that years ago, in a place he would not name and they did not need to know, he had been a young medic carrying the wounded off broken aircraft and out of burning wreckage and into a forward casualty receiving and surgical unit, the fast, hard place that set up wherever the dying could not wait, and that the chief nurse of that unit, the one who ran the whole casualty floor, who could sort and save a hangar full of the burned and the crushed with the power flickering and the cold coming in and the wounded arriving faster than there were hands, who never lost her head and never lost the room, and saved more people than anyone could count. The one the medics talked about in the tones they used for very few people had been Captain Dana Vance. He told them he had carried people to her that no one on earth should have been able to save, and that she had saved them, in the cold and the dark, with her hands and her voice, and a whistle exactly like the one on her badge right now. He told them that the way she had just run their terminal, the triage, the treatment area, the leadership in the disaster, was not something she had picked up. It was who she was. It was what she had done, night after night, for 10 years, in places where the help was never coming, and the plan never survived contact, and the only thing between a crowd of the wounded and death was a person who refused to panic. And the floor listened in a stunned silence and turned, all of it, to look at the gray-haired nurse they had pitied and patronized, and two of them, benched and written up, and saw her finally for the first time. Dr. Adrian Cole stood at the edge of that circle of people, and of everyone on that floor, the reveal landed on him the hardest, because he had the furthest to fall. He thought of the month he had given her. He thought of the supply cart she had reorganized so a hand could find what it needed under stress, and understood now that he had been irritated by the hard-won wisdom of someone who had needed exactly that under fire. He thought of the warning she had given him that very afternoon, that a night like this with the ramp icing might be a night to stage extra hands and gear, and understood that the chief nurse of an expeditionary unit had seen the whole shape of this disaster coming hours before it arrived. He thought of the whistle and the drills he had mocked, and understood, with a lurch, that she carried the whistle because she was the one person in the building who had ever needed to call a crowd of the dying to order with it, and drilled the empty concourse at night because she had sworn she would never again be caught unready. He thought of the sentence he had said in front of his whole clinic. "Go sit in the break room, nurse. You're not needed out here tonight." He had benched Captain Dana Vance on the night an aircraft came down, and the shame of it went through him like ice water. Not the small shame of being wrong about a fact, but the large shame of a man who has just discovered that his entire way of measuring people, the whole proud arithmetic of his life, had been not just mistaken, but exactly, precisely backwards, and that the proof of it had been standing quietly in his clinic all along, carrying a whistle he had laughed at. But Dana Vance did not have time for his shame, and she would not have wanted his salute, and this is the part of her that the night finally showed everyone, because the moment the reveal was done, the moment Hale had said his piece and the floor understood, she turned away from all of it, away from the recognition she had spent 4 years not seeking, and she said, "Tom, your timing is perfect. I have 40 casualties and a treatment line and not enough hands, and you have a full team and gear and transport that made it through the ice. I need you. Here's what I need." And she put Thomas Hale's disaster team to work, dividing his people into the machine she had already built, sending his physicians to the worst of her cases and his logisticians to solve the supply and the transport. Because she was still, more than anything she had ever been, the person who runs toward the work, and the reveal was over before she had taken a single breath to enjoy it. Because there were people who were still dying, and a name was not going to save them. Only hands would. And something about that, the way she stepped over her own vindication without even pausing to pick it up, told the watching floor more about who Captain Dana Vance was than the salute ever could. And here is what the cold taught Dr. Adrian Cole in the longest night of his life, while he worked at the side of a nurse he had benched and watched her do the thing he could not. It taught him that he had had it exactly backwards. He had believed his whole career that the hierarchy of medicine ran downhill from the physician, that he was the apex and everyone else was support. The nurses and the techs arranged below him to carry out what his judgment decided, and that an airport clinic nurse was the bottom of that hill, and the disaster had turned the hill upside down in a single hour, because the thing the airport actually needed, when the help did not come and the system did not hold, and everything that could be planned for and credentialed and made comfortable had been stripped away, was not a man who could perform a flawless procedure under perfect conditions. It was a person who knew what to do when the conditions were gone. It was someone who had been trained, somewhere he could not imagine, to be the calm at the center of catastrophe, to sort the dying, to make do, to lead. It was, precisely and only, the nurse he had sent off the floor, and the most polished director that airport had ever hired stood in the cold and watched the woman he had humiliated take command of his clinic and his terminal and his disaster, and understood, with a slow, sick vertigo, that he had learned more in the last few hours about what medicine actually is than he had learned in his entire confident career, and that he owed every scrap of it to a person he had written off on sight. It was much later, in the gray hour before dawn, when the worst was past, when the disaster team and the ambulances that had finally clawed their way down the frozen highway and the staff Dana had built into a machine had brought the terminal back from the edge, when the casualties were stabilized and moving out and the dying were saved or peacefully not, and the great anxious crowd had thinned, that the last piece of her came out, and it came out quietly, the way everything about her did. She was sitting for the first time in hours on an overturned crate in a corner of the cleared concourse, bone-tired, and Ray Donnelly brought her a cup of something hot, and Thomas Hale sat down across from her, and Dr. Cole, who did not quite dare to sit, but could not make himself leave, stood nearby in the half-light, and Hale nodded at the whistle, and the dull coin clipped to her badge, the things the airport had mocked, and he said, "Lo, you still carry his whistle." And Dana's hand went up to it, to the worn aluminum and the gray coin, and she turned the coin over once, the old gesture, and for the first time that night something in her face softened toward grief. And she told them, because the night had earned it, about the man the whistle and the coin had come from. She told them about her old unit chief, the senior officer who had built that casualty floor and taught her everything, the man who had pressed the signal whistle into her hands on her first bad night, when a crowd of the wounded came in all at once and she stood frozen at the edge of it, and told her that a nurse who cannot turn a panicking crowd into a working one is not yet ready for the nights that matter, and that the whistle was so she would always have a way to make 100 frightened people listen. And she told them how he had pressed the coin into her palm at the end of the worst stretch of all, and told her that people who do what they did do not get parades. They get to go home, and the coin is so that on the days the world tells you that you are nothing, you remember the nights you were everything. And she told them that he had not gotten to go home, that he had been killed on a night much like this one, working in the cold over someone else, and that she carried the whistle and the coin not as a memorial, but as a working tool and a working creed. Because he had been right, the disaster does come, and the only honest way to honor him was to be, always, ready for the night it did. There was, she said, a letter, folded small in her locker, that he had left for the people of his unit, and she could quote the last line of it from memory, and she did, into the gray dawn quiet of that battered terminal, "Be the calm. When everything else fails, be the calm, and the rest can be rebuilt." And the people who heard it understood, at last, the whole of the woman, and where the calm had come from, and what it had cost. Adrian Cole found her alone a little after that, in the first real light of morning, when the ice had begun to let go, and the airport was waking into the enormous work of cleaning up after a night like that one. He had been rehearsing what to say for an hour, and had thrown all of it away, because everything he came up with was about him, about his guilt, his apology, his need to be forgiven. And somewhere in that long, cold night, he had learned just enough to understand that an apology that is really about the person giving it is not an apology at all. So when he finally stood in front of her, he kept it simple. "I benched you," he said. "I sent you off the floor and told you that you weren't needed on the worst night this airport has ever had, and I was wrong about you in every way a person can be wrong about another person. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, because you don't owe me that, and I'm not going to pretend one bad night taught me everything, because it didn't. But I wanted to say it to your face, with no one else here. I was wrong, Captain, and I have a great deal to learn. And you are the person at this airport I most need to learn it from, and I know I have no right to ask." And Dana Vance looked at him for a long moment, at the polished young director, stripped all the way down to something honest at last, and she did not gloat, and she did not wave it away, because both of those would have been a kind of lie. She just said, "It's Dana in this clinic. I left the rank in another country. And you're not a bad clinician, Adrian. You were just an untested one. Now you know what it's like when the system doesn't come and the help isn't there. Don't waste it." And it was in its way the most generous thing she could have said, because it was the truth, and it left him a door to walk through. And he knew it, and he nodded, and for once in his life he did not say anything else. The reckoning with Gerald Pruitt was quieter and in its way more complete, because it required nothing of Dana at all. The administrator came to the clinic late the next day, once the story of the night had gone through the airport and then through the region, the story of the crash and the ice and the nurse who had run the whole thing in a freezing terminal. The story that the disaster team and the saved casualties and Dr. Cole himself were all telling the same way, and he came with his file in his hand and a great many things he had planned to say. And he found that there was no version of any of them that survived contact with what had actually happened. The drills he had written up as unauthorized had saved the terminal. The staged kit he had flagged as a violation had been the first thing she reached for. The whistle he had called a professionalism concern had been the thing that turned a panicking crowd into 100 working hands. Every single item in his careful file was, it turned out, evidence of exactly the opposite of what he had built it to prove. And the formal counseling notice she had signed without complaint now read, "To anyone who saw it as the most damning thing in the building, a record of an institution writing up the one person who was ready for the disaster it had told her could not happen." He did not, in the end, say much of anything. He took his file away, and it was never spoken of again, and that was its own kind of justice. The quiet kind. The kind that does not need a confrontation because the facts have already won. The casualties from that broken jet lived. Far more of them than anyone had any right to expect from an aircraft that came off an iced runway an hour from the nearest trauma center on a night the roads were closed. The burned and the crushed and the quiet gray ones who would have slipped away unattended in a less ordered place. The young woman whose chest Dana had decompressed by feel against a pillar, the man whose back she had kept the firefighters from severing, dozens of people who walked out of that story alive because a bench nurse had built a system in a cold terminal and held it together until the help could come. And when the formal review came, weeks later, the reviewers wrote, in the careful language such reports use, that the survival outcomes were attributable in significant part to the actions of the on-site clinic staff and one nurse in particular, whose leadership during the incident had been, the report said, exemplary. Dana Vance read that line once in the clinic break room with her thumb on the worn coin, and then she set the report down and went back to work, because a line in a report was not why she had done any of it, and she had learned a long time ago not to need the world to write down what she already knew. The salute that the genre promises, the public moment of recognition, did come, but it came the way real recognition comes to people like Dana Vance, sideways and quiet and on her own terms. There was no ceremony because she would not have one, but the airport changed. There were new drills now, real ones, that operations not only permitted but required, and Dana ran them, and the clinic staff came, Adrian first among them, and learned from her how to run a mass casualty when the help is an hour away and the plan has fallen apart, and learned, more importantly, the thing the night had taught them all, which is that the person who knows the actual work is worth more than the person who has only ever had the polished version of it, and that you can never tell. From the title, or the age, or the gray hair, or the battered whistle, who in the room that person is going to turn out to be. And the young ones, Marcus and the gate agent, who had held a hand and a light, who had watched the woman they overlooked save them all, carried that lesson out into their own lives, into places Dana would never see, and that, more than any salute, was the real vindication, the kind that does not end when the applause stops, because it goes on living in the people it changed. And Dana Vance went back to being a nurse, which was all she had ever wanted to be, at a busy regional airport clinic that now understood, finally, what it had in her, though she would have been just as steady if it never had. She still worked the quiet, thankless cases and the overnight shifts nobody else would take. She still moved through the terminal the way still water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, except that no one underestimated her anymore. And on the first slow night after it was all over, she did the thing she always did at the start of a shift, the small ritual she had carried home from another life. She took the worn matte gray aluminum signal whistle on its faded olive cord, and she pressed her thumb to the cool gray metal and felt the weight of it, the whistle that had turned a panicking terminal into a working one on the worst night any of them had known. And then she let it go, and she clipped it to her badge beside the dull gray coin, and she squared the badge reel against her chest and rolled her shoulders once and stepped out onto the concourse to do her job, ready, the way she had promised a dead man she would always be ready, for the next ordinary night that might not stay ordinary. That is the thing about the people we are too quick to write off. The quiet ones, the older ones, the ones who carry strange small tools and ask the questions no one wants to hear and never tell you what they have already lived through. The world looks at them and sees the past, sees someone slow, sees someone finished, and tells them to stay in their lane, and sends them off the floor. And then, on the night the plane comes off the ice, and the road's close, and everything that was supposed to save you simply fails to come, the world finds out that the person it benched was the only one who ever knew what to do. Dana Vance never asked anyone to see her. She only ever asked to be allowed to do the work. But there are some people whose worth will not stay hidden forever, because sooner or later a night comes that needs exactly what they are, and on that night, the room finally sees, and is humbled, and is saved. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. When you think of the moment Captain Dana Vance became undeniable, was it the instant she climbed onto a row of seats, blew an old whistle over a panicking terminal, and told 100 frightened people that there was a system now and she was it? Or was it the moment a disaster commander came to attention on that cold floor and called her by the name she had hidden for years? Tell me in the comments which one was the real turning point for you, and tell me about the quiet person in your own life that the world was wrong about. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they are always, in the end, worth the salute.